Hello, my name is Abe Neiman, and I completed my internship this spring here at the Wylie House Museum and at the Elingle Craig Preservation Lab across town. My project this semester was to help inventory and to contextualize the library of Theophilus Adam Wylie, a former interim president of Indiana University and university librarian who lived at the Wylie House from 1852 until his death in 1895. So there's this plaque on display at the Wylie House that was given by Theophilus Wylie's grandchildren, Anton T. Boysen and Marie Louisa Boysen, who both attended IU. And they explain that they are donating their grandfather's library to Indiana University in the belief that it has a story to tell of the culture and scholarship for which the university stood in the days when it was young. I began my internship with the Wylie House Museum this spring with the vague understanding that Theophilus Wylie was a professor of natural sciences at Indiana University and was also a Presbyterian minister. But as my research into the provenance of Theophilus Wylie's library has deepened, I have come to see that Theophilus Wylie's grandchildren were right. His library tells a fascinating story, not only about the history of Indiana University, but also about historical developments in the United States in science, religion, industry, immigration, and slavery that were reshaping America in the years up to the Civil War. Theophilus Wylie was initially hired by Indiana University as the college's professor of natural philosophy and chemistry in 1837, when his cousin, Dr. Andrew Wylie, was the institution's first president. He had been born in Philadelphia, attended the University of Pennsylvania from 1828 until 1833, and had been licensed as a Reformed Presbyterian minister in 1836. But when he arrived in Bloomington, his focus quickly turned to the sciences, and in his early career he is credited with building the university's first chemistry lab in 1840, with introducing geology instruction to the university, and to have served at 37 years, the longest tenure of any university librarian at IU to date. But despite his longevity and apparent influence, Theophilus Wylie seems to have had a retiring demeanor, as attested by his former student and colleague Amzi Atwater. I would agree that spending time with Theophilus Wylie's books is one of the best ways to get to know him. His library attests to the breadth of his interests, which encompassed classical Greek and Latin literature, theology, physics, chemistry, astronomy, geology, and what was then known as practical science or mechanics. His books were evidently read, as many contain annotations, mathematical formulas, and also numerous drawings of faces and other odd scenes that could serve as material for a study in themselves. But soon after I began examining the books in Theophilus Wylie's library, I began to notice an overall pattern in terms of their subject matter and their apparent provenance. While many of the books were about scientific subjects and were signed by Theophilus Wylie, a large portion of the books, no fewer than 80 separate titles, are also signed by Theophilus Wylie's father, Samuel Brown Wylie, a Reformed Presbyterian minister and scholar of ancient languages in Philadelphia, who has turned out to be a more and more significant figure the more I have learned about him. Samuel Brown Wylie was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia from 1803 until his death in 1852. He was made a member of the American Philosophical Society in 1806, was awarded an honorary doctorate of divinity from Dickinson College in 1816, and was the professor of ancient languages at the University of Pennsylvania from 1828, afterwards serving as the vice provost of that university from 1834 until 1845. In an entry in the Reverend John L. Blake's Biographical Dictionary, published in Philadelphia in 1857, Blake writes that few men have ranked higher than Dr. Wylie in classical literature and theological attainments as a successful teacher, a good pastor, or a practical Christian. But while most of the books attributable to Samuel B. Wylie relate to classical philology, there are also a surprisingly large number of books on scientific and technical subjects, less surprising when we consider Samuel Wylie's membership in the American Philosophical Society. There are also a number of older books from the 17th and 18th century, including a monumental 6-volume set of Brian Walton's Polyglot Bible of 1657, and a 1672 copy of the Works of Descartes, printed by Daniel Elsevier. But beyond the books that may be classed as Samuel B. Wylie-related books, there are a larger number of books related to the sciences, and these are signed by Theophilus Wylie, and typically not his father. As Sean Martin, an IU doctoral student who previously worked with Theophilus Wylie's library, found in his examination of the library, the authors of these books seem generally to be Theophilus Wylie's contemporaries. But unlike J. Lawrence Smith, whose vision of scientific engagement Sean Martin contrasts with Wylie's, there was little in Theophilus Wylie's background prior to 1837 which connected him in any official capacity with the world of science. So in order to answer the question, why did Theophilus Wylie choose science rather than just the ministry as his calling, I had to go beyond the library and consult other sources, such as the journal that Wylie wrote from 1835 till the end of his life. The journals show that Theophilus Wylie did have informal connections to the world of early American science, even when he was still in Philadelphia. He was a close friend of John Fries Fraser, the future editor of the Journal of the Franklin Institute, and a successor in the position of Vice Provost of the University of Pennsylvania to Samuel B. Wylie, who, after Fraser lost both of his parents when he was 8 years old, adopted Fraser and raised him while preparing him to enter the University of Pennsylvania. But a keystone event in the history of Theophilus Wylie's development into a professor of natural philosophy would seem to be the trip he reports taking in his journal with Fraser on August 25th, 1835, up to geological sites around the Manayunk Banks on the Schuylkill River. In this lengthy entry to his journal, Wylie waxed poetically about the scenery and the minerals that Fraser shows him. The place was delightful, and we spent an agreeable half-hour in it, just such a place would the ancients have dedicated to Diana or some of the Potamides. After returning home, he goes the next day to talk to Fraser again, and, while in his room looked at some admirable etchings by Retsch for the Song of the Bell, nothing for a long time has pleased me so much. There cannot be more poetry in this poem itself than there is in the sketches. So it seems likely that Theophilus Wylie's relationship with Fraser influenced his decision to become a professor of natural philosophy and chemistry as much as just about any other factor. So okay, we know what interested Theophilus Wylie in science, but where did his science books come from? Well, a distinct shift happens in Theophilus Wylie's journal after he's hired as a professor of natural philosophy at Indiana University. We suddenly find that Wylie is purchasing and reading a very large volume of books in the sciences. And when we actually examine the distribution of publication dates across all of Theophilus Wylie's books, it does appear that the greatest portion of them were actually acquired in the 2 decades after he took on the role of professor of chemistry and natural philosophy in 1837, with his purchasing activity cooling off somewhat after 1860. Now, on several occasions in the journal, we find that Theophilus Wylie reports that he went to a Mr. Dobson to buy books and maps. And my best guess right now is that this bookseller is Judah Dobson, who also served as the main publisher of the Journal of the Franklin Institute. But the books Wylie purchases from Dobson are not for the most part published by Dobson, because the primary source of Dobson's revenue wouldn't have been his original publications, but rather his bookstore and the distribution of books that he imports from other publishers. And the publishing houses that ultimately became the most successful in the mid-19th century were those like Carey, Lee, and Blanchard in Philadelphia and Harper and Brothers of New York. And they both produced original books, and they developed extensive distribution partnerships whereby the printing was outsourced to poorer country printers, and the main role of the publisher slash bookseller was to bring together these vast distribution networks that include local booksellers in far-flung places like Cincinnati, Louisville, Indianapolis, and eventually Bloomington. And we can actually see evidence of both sides of these publisher-bookseller partnerships in Theophilus Wylie's library. First, we can see that among the cities listed for place of publication, a handful of cities dominate. We can also see, likewise, the dominance of publishers with large distribution networks. And the data from our inventory can also track the relative predominance of different cities, subjects of books, and publishers in Theophilus Wylie's library over the course of the 19th century. So a really useful tool for studying the history of the book. One lingering question I had while examining Theophilus Wylie's library was how he knew which books to order from New York and Philadelphia, or which to acquire on his occasional trips back to the East. And the Indiana University catalogs from 1854 onward list books that were used as classroom texts for various courses that were taught in the sciences. And what we frequently find in the library is that these books are not only present, but they are often heavily annotated by Theophilus Wylie, which indicates that these books were actually used directly in the course of Theophilus's lectures. As to how Theophilus Wylie kept abreast of the latest textbooks and developments in the sciences from Bloomington, the answer would seem to lie in his sets of periodicals like the Edinburgh Review and the Journal of the Franklin Institute, large 40-volume sets, where he would not only be able to read scientific papers, but also reviews and advertisements of the latest publications. Now, I discuss all of this and more in an introductory blog post that I wrote for the Wylie House blog. I also wrote another sort of lengthy article / blog post on Theophilus Wylie, the Reformed Presbyterian Church, and the attitudes of the church and Wylie towards slavery. It's a fascinating story that I'm glad to have explored, and overall I'm very pleased with how much I've been able to learn during this internship.